We're going to be talking about making the connection between literacy and music training today. Before we get into this conversation, let me just quickly go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers today, please drop them into the Q&A and add your name and affiliation. You can ask your question at any time throughout the conversation, and we will get to them during the audience Q&A at the end. Also, we're going to be putting a link to an evaluation survey into the chat, and we'll also send it in a follow-up email. And if you would, please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps EWA improve. I'm Holly Corby. I'm an independent education and parenting journalist and the author of Building Better Citizens. I'm a regular contributor for Edutopia, as well as NPR's Mindshift blog out of San Francisco member station KQED. I have also been nominated for an Education Writers Association Award for outstanding reporting on how dyslexia is handled at school. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Stephen Holoquist and Dr. Nina Kraus. Stephen Holoquist is a developmental psychologist who studies the impact of poverty on child development and how programs that expand educational opportunities for children can mitigate those effects. He's the project director of the Regulation, Education, and Neuroscience Lab at Lehman College at the City University of New York. Nina Kraus is the Hugh Knowles Professor of Communication Sciences, Neurobiology, and Otolaryngology at Northwestern University. As a biologist and amateur musician, she studies how our brain makes sense of the sounds we hear and published the book Of Sound Mind, How Our Brain Constructs a Meaningful Sonic World. So welcome. Oh, there's the book. Welcome, Nina, and welcome, Stephen, today. Earlier this year, with the release of the National Assessment for Educational Progress data, we saw further evidence of continued decline in American students' basic reading and math skills, sparking debates about the impact of pandemic-era school closures and the road to academic recovery. And as states overhaul their standards and curricula for reading instruction, and they're all moving towards a more evidence-based approach to literacy, it has rightfully captured the attention of reporters across the nation. But what might be missing from this conversation is the neuroscience of reading. So there's no reading center in the human brain, but there are areas dedicated to music and language. And research has shown that music training is one way to prime the brain for reading. So from babies exposed to simple melodies who can detect subtle shifts in the rhythms of language, to how musical instruction has helped immigrant preschoolers learn phonics, music and music education is associated with notable development in the parts of the brain that process sound and speech, which is a key to fluency. So today we're going to take a look at the proven academic benefits of music exposure and training, and how neurobiology explains the connection between music and literacy. And our expert speakers will cover key background research to help inform your coverage. And so at the end, we'll dedicate the last 15 minutes to audience questions. And so if Stephen and Nina are ready, let's get started.
All set. Who would you like to go first?
Nina, I would like to start with you. Reporters, education reporters, we talk a lot about the science of reading in our education coverage. And so could you tell us a little bit about what your research says about the sound of reading and the underlying neurological processes involved?
Yeah, with great pleasure. And first of all, it is so important, I think more than ever, as the journalist and writer world is becoming smaller and smaller, for writers to really be doing diligence on their research and on keeping up with all of the information that science is slowly pulling together, that basically very, very, very much supports the importance of music education. And the more people know, and it's really your job to let them know. So I'm glad for your work. Let me start by saying that the hearing brain and what happens when we make sense of sound is enormous. And it involves what we know. So it involves our cognitive systems, our attention, our memory. It involves how we feel. It involves how we move. Sound itself is motion. It involves how we combine information from our other senses. It even involves our gut. The fancy way of saying it is that processing sound engages our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems. So you can see that there's tremendous overlap between what happens, when you engage through sound with music and reading. We learn to speak first, and then we make a sound to meaning associations with the letters on the page. Music is this wonderful, holistic way of engaging almost everything that is important for education. There are ingredients in sound. People don't pay attention to sound very much because it's invisible. And, we live in a very visually biased world. And, in the same way as this watch of mine has ingredients, a texture, a size, a shape, a color, sound has ingredients like pitch, timing, and timbre, phase, loudness. But these are invisible, and yet they are very, very important for language. We were approached a number of years ago by founders of music programs in Los Angeles and in Chicago public schools, who came to us and said, all of the teachers in the many schools that we serve know already that the students who make music are the better students academically. What is going on in their brain? And so we embarked on a longitudinal study where we followed these kids for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the same kid, and they were matched with kids who had a different form of enrichment. And what we were really able to discover is, first of all, that yes, indeed, the children who made music were the better readers. They had better language skills. But importantly, one of the things that we do in my lab, which, and I hope that folks will take a look at our website and how we do the work we do. But, as I'm talking to you now, the neurons in your brain that respond to sound are producing electricity. And so we are able to capture this electricity. It's completely objective. And we can see how good a job your brain is doing at processing the pitch, the timing, the timbre, the phase, the loudness, all the different ingredients of sound. And we see that, first of all, we know that the ingredients that are important in making music and the ones that are important for reading and literacy and are the same ingredients. So when you're strengthening your brain by making music, you're strengthening your brain for language. We've also discovered that particularly, and this will relate to, I think, what Stephen will have to say, these are all studies in kids who are living in poverty in the gang reduction zones of Los Angeles and in some Chicago public schools. And we found a neural signature of poverty, which consists not only of poorer coding of these important sound ingredients, so how's a child to learn? And also they had excessively noisy brains. Our nervous system is always on, neurons are firing. And if you can think of the static, like on a radio or between TV channels when we had those, that static is very elevated in kids who live in poverty. And we wondered whether a music education could help offset that. And in fact, it can. And then finally, music connects us, and it connects us the way hardly anything I know does. And so it's very, very important. We live in a very disconnected world. We live in an excessively noisy world. Depression and anxiety, alienation, the ability to focus, all of that is on the rise. And music is really a way, and tolerance is on the rise. Music brings us together and it teaches us. You know, we have kids, and this was one of the big lessons learned in these schools with music programs, is that kids would find themselves making music with kids of other cultures and religions that they otherwise wouldn't be engaging with. So these are just some of the things, but you know, I'm a scientist, I'm a biologist, I look at the biological evidence. I really did write this book for you, for the journalists, for parents, teachers. It is conversationally written, deeply cited with all of the best science that I know. It has pictures. I worked with an illustrator, so there are 80 original illustrations because science is art and art is science. So I hope that this as a resource, and also our website, especially if you look at the neuroeducation pages, you will find the actual articles that will support what it is that I just said.
When I read Of Sound Mind as a reporter, the thing that blew my mind was that I had been reporting on the science of reading, and I knew about the sound ingredients needed to sound out words, that phonemic awareness is really hearing those sounds. And that's how, when you connect that to print, that is how you learn to read. And I was amazed to learn that those same sound ingredients are used when you teach music, and that those two skills overlap. I think that is really interesting.
Me too.
Well, great. So Stephen, let's talk a little bit about your work. So in your research, you found really interesting connections between students participating in an out-of-school orchestra program and then seeing subsequent improvements in their academic performance and executive functioning. So could you tell us a little more about that work and how music learning and executive functioning are connected?
Sure. Thanks, Holly. I'll start by saying that it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Professor Krauss. I often think that, on some level, what I'm doing is just kind of documenting the more obvious manifestations of the work she does, looking at some of the effects of music in ways that don't require as advanced methods. We worked, and I'm actually going there tomorrow. I've worked for almost 10 years with an organization called Play on Philly, which is an organization that offers out of school, after school primarily, musical instruction to children who otherwise would not receive it, I think would be the right way to say it. Now, in many cases, that is because those children are themselves growing up in poverty, not all cases. But there are a lot of structural barriers to studying music. And that's something I think a lot about in my work. So much of education is about access. It's not really that we don't know how to provide good training on orchestral instruments. There are many, many children who get that every day. It's not the case that we don't know how to provide good, high quality early education. It's that those high quality educational opportunities are often out of the reach of certain students in the United States. So when I started working with Play on Philly in 2012, I suppose, they were at one flagship site. They've since expanded, and they were offering musical instruction on orchestral instruments, primarily in an orchestral ensemble setting, though they also were receiving private lessons to children from grades 2 to 8. They since have expanded at both ends of the age range and serve kids as young as preschool and all the way through high school, and actually beyond through some kind of mentoring programs. And they were working at this school in West Philadelphia, which happened to be a parochial school. And the students who were at that school had been asked if they wanted to participate in this program. And the folks who ran Play on Philly, I think, had anticipated that, well, they maybe get like 80 kids who would be interested, and they could accommodate about that many. And in fact, they had about 200 kids. show up. So that represented a dilemma for them, and an opportunity for me, because what it allowed us to do was to create a lottery, which was really the only fair way to see when who was going to get into the program first, basically. Ultimately, the idea is that everyone would get to attend, but they couldn't take that many kids that all at once. And so that's what we did. And we worked with the program for a few years. And so at the end of when we wrapped that phase of data collection, we had data for children who were either not yet in the program or been in the program from anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And what we did with those children was we got access with their parents' permission, obviously, to their academic records. So test scores, the children take a standardized test that measures both English language arts and math, and then also their teacher assigned grades. And we also administered a set of measures of executive functions. So executive functions, and there has been a lot of, well, I suppose now digital ink spilled about what exactly are executive functions. And it actually is a very interesting and important question. But on some fundamental level, executive functions are a set of core cognitive abilities that allow us to set and pursue goals. Whatever those goals might be, they can be very long-term goals. I want to, get into college. They could be much more modest goals. I'm gonna go make dinner. But the idea is that those basic cognitive processes, which at least include working memory, the ability to kind of hold something in mind and manipulate it, inhibitory control, the ability to inhibit, sometimes called a dominant or prepotent behavioral response, and cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift your attention willfully from things that are maybe less relevant in the here and now to things that are more relevant. Of course, what's relevant in the here and now it's always changing. So there are tasks that you can ask children to do on a computer, paper and pencil, other kinds of tasks that measure those 3 core cognitive abilities. And so we had kids do a set of those tasks. We chose to use them on a computer for reasons that I won't go into. And then we looked at whether children who had been, again, randomly via the lottery, selected to participate in the program or not, did better on their grades, on their test scores, and on these measures of executive functions. And the answer was yes, and in some cases, considerably better. Education, well, you all know this. I almost said that as though I wasn't talking. I'd forgotten who I was talking to. Effect sizes in education research are not usually very, very large. And there are reasons for that, because if you think about all the things that contribute to a child's reading score on a particular day, when they're 8 years old or 10 years old, it actually is remarkable, in my opinion, that something like going to an after-school music program 1 day a week, 4 days a week in the case of Play on Philly, can move the needle on that sort of thing. Because you're talking about, by the time a child is 10, you're talking about everything from, what was the quality of their mother's prenatal, when she was pregnant, what did that look like, to did that child, have adequate access to nutritional resources when they were very young, to did they have access to high quality early care and education. So the fact that we saw that you ever see effect sizes that are detectable is always, to my mind, something about a minor miracle. And we were seeing ones that were either as large or in some cases 1.5 or 2 times again as large as what you would see. And one of the things that was really interesting was the children in that study that were assigned to the control group. It was what's called an active control group. They weren't just sent home or let out of the school to kind of roam around or do whatever. They were in an after-school program that was a tutoring program. So there was a point when we were first doing the study where I thought I had a moment of real panic, where I thought, oh, well, I'm a fan for rigorous designs, but we may have overdone it here, because we were basically pitting a music program and its effects on reading and math and executive functions against the effects of a tutoring program where the kids were getting tutored in reading and math. And nevertheless, we saw these differences. And the fact, the relationship between the executive functions, once we saw the differences in executive function, we kind of expected to see the differences in academic performance, because there is a tremendous amount of research that demonstrates that both concurrently and longitudinally, that how you do on those measures of executive functions is very predictive of how you'll do in school. Now, there's a lot of shared kind of environmental influence contributing to both those things. But it's also the case, and there's obviously shared genetic influence, but it's also the case that those particular skills that I enumerated really do matter a lot for how kids do in a classroom, right? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of succeeding in a classroom is being able to inhibit the prepotent response to stop listening to whatever your teacher is saying and doodle something on the margins of the page. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more about it as we go along.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one thing that I want to ask you just right away, Stephen, is why? So why does music training, or what is your theory? Why is music training so uniquely capable? Because I'll tell you, every single school on the planet says we want our kids to have executive functioning skills.
Right.
Why does music work in this way? What is it doing?
So I have a couple ideas. And it's actually funny because pursuing those ideas has brought me ever so slightly closer to Professor Krause's work. When you look at kids doing EF tasks, executive functions tasks, you notice very quickly, and I sat next to every one of those 200 odd kids as they did them, that sometimes a kid's performance is can't, and a lot of times it's won't, right? It's not that they really can't remember what the next digit in that sequence of digits that's testing their working memory is. It's that they're sick of telling you what that next digit is and they don't want to do it anymore. And so part of it, I think, is persistence or perseverance, task perseverance, as it's sometimes. And you think about, on some level, what enables you to succeed in life. It's doing things you don't particularly want to do right then. And part of what allows a student to succeed in music, what they're trained to do in music, is sometimes, okay, we have to do that again, right? Like let's take it from the top. Let's work on that measure. Oh, I do not think the bowings are right there. Let's slow it down a half tempo and do it again. There are a lot of aspects of musical training that I think just naturally build persistence or task perseverance. So actually, in our current work with Play on Philly, we have the kids do an impossible puzzle task, which is a task of persistence, and we're busily coding all those video data, because what we've seen so far is that the kids, sure enough, after about a year in Play on Philly, they'll keep banging away on this task that they'll never be able to solve. And the other kids will be more likely to give up. So I think that's part of it. But another really big part of it is what's going on under those kids' skin and the ways in which music education may be reorganizing kids' neurophysiological function. So I have a colleague that I've worked with now for a few years. Her name's Ellie Brown. She's done a lot of work with Kaleidoscope Settlement Music School, which is a program, Kaleidoscope, which is a program of the Settlement Music School. It's a Head Start. It's an arts integrated Head Start program. And she and I have done some looking and have found that music education and arts education more generally seems to help reduce levels of cortisol in children who are raised in poverty. And so we know then, Professor Krause is much more able to speak on this at length than I am, so I'll just kind of allude to it. But, we know that cortisol is an indicator of levels of activity in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That is a subcortical system that is responsible for mobilizing kind of metabolic resource energy in response to threats, which is adaptive, except if you live in an environment that's constantly threatening, and then it can become problematic because the activity of that system can become recalibrated. And there's been some work that's demonstrated that higher levels of cortisol in early childhood are associated with poor performance on measures of executive function. And there's also some work that shows that there's an association between higher levels of cortisol and brain activity in the prefrontal cortex and brain development in the prefrontal cortex, which is the putative seat of executive function. So that's one aspect to it. Another is another neurophysiological system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for helping support states of kind of calm engagement. And one of the things that you do notice when you're sitting next to the kids who have been musically trained, when they sit down after a couple of years of that training to do one of those executive functions tasks at the computer, they behave differently. It's almost as though they're sitting down to a rehearsal is what I've often thought of it, right? They know that they're going to do something challenging, and they know that it's going to require some attention, but they're not kind of freaking out about it, right? They're sort of at that sweet spot in that Wundt curve between sort of apathy and over arousal. And so we're actually now measuring kids' parasympathetic function both in the music classroom, which has been quite the thing because those sensors don't always love movement, but also while kids are engaged in these tasks, the puzzle task, the executive functions tasks, and looking to see if there are differences in how children are recruiting those neurophysiological resources while they're engaged in those tasks. And if those differences are in fact reflected in how kids' parasympathetic nervous system activity is going while they're actually in the context of musical instruction.
Well, I can't wait to hear the results of that, because I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is, music in a way makes you calmer. And when you're a little calmer, you can think better, plan ahead better. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think it reduces, and Nina hit the nail right on the head, it reduces levels of stress. Why? Because we are a fundamentally social species, and engaging in collaborative music making, as you do in an orchestral ensemble setting, may go a long way to help regulating the activity of those different neurophysiological systems. So not only reducing levels of stress in the case, and that's reflected in the HPA axis activity, but also tuning the parasympathetic nervous system to prepare students more readily to engage in willful, thoughtful, challenging, but not aversive activity.
Great. Nina, I have a question for you. In your book of Sound Mind, you dedicate several chapters to explaining how sound really is the root of language and language learning, and then how music making can be, critical to enhancing literacy, because we need that sound in order to learn to read. For the reporters, what do you wish that reporters knew, and understood about these connections, and not just reporters, but people who design and evaluate and, and advocate for educational systems? How can you break this down so we can understand those connections?
Well, I'll do my best. First of all, one of the things I just wanted to comment on, one of the things that Dr. Steve said, a couple of times he said, after a year or two, that this takes time. And so we're talking about fundamental changes that are happening in the nervous system. And thank goodness we don't have a nervous system that changes in profound fundamental ways every second, or we'd be even more confused than we already are. To make these fundamental changes really does take time. And so we become different. We become different people. We become, we are wired in a different way. So you asked, what did you ask? Tell me.
Yeah, that how can we
Oh,
break
yeah.
it down for reporters, so we
so
understand the connection?
Well, there are a couple of connections, so the one is if you think of sound, when we think of some important ingredients are the fundamental frequency and the harmonics. Now, the fundamental frequency is important for pitch, and people think of it in music as, this is what, if we have a piano and a tuba playing the same note, they're playing the same pitch, the same fundamental frequency. But they sound different because their harmonics are different. So they have a different timbre. Now, the exact same thing is happening with reading. If you take, I write in the book about the mighty da. So just a simple syllable like da has timing cues, it has a fundamental frequency, it has harmonics, it has all of these ingredients, and the timing, the harmonics, what we call the FM sweeps. So when you go from a consonant to a vowel, from a d to an a, and so the difference between, did I say bad or dad, is encoded in these ingredients. And so if you strengthen the encoding of these ingredients and how the brain makes sense of sound automatically, because if you, again, when you're making music, you do things again and again and again, and eventually your nervous system learns automatically to respond to certain things. So if you are sound asleep and I have electrodes on your head and I say the sound of your name, your brain will automatically respond to that, even though you're sound asleep, because it has learned, it profoundly changed your connection with sound. And importantly, again, riffing off of Dr. Steve, this idea of executive function is when you make music or when you read, but when you make music, you are making sound to meaning connections. So, what things mean is entirely important for how you think about everything that you do, and what you pay attention to and what you don't pay attention to, what you remember and what you don't remember. So, this is tremendously important. And another thing that is very much a part of the sound, part of it, and relates to stress, is noise. We live in a noisy world. Classrooms are notoriously noisy. They often have busy streets outside. Chairs are scraping, a cafeteria, being on the bus, and we're learning in these noisy environments. But one of the things that we have learned is that biologically, people who make music across the lifespan are simply better at making sense of sound, of not only hearing and responding to, say, sentences that are delivered with increasing levels of noise, but the brain's response. A person who will make music will have a strong response to all these different ingredients that I've been talking about in quiet and in noise, whereas the person who has not made music will have strong brain responses in quiet. But the minute you challenge the system, this is what happens. And noise. We're finally figuring out as a society that very loud sounds are bad for your ears. But hardly anyone thinks about it. And this is an important story for a reporter, for anyone, for education, for our neighbors, is that moderate level sounds very much damage our brain. So sound is our alarm sense from an evolutionary perspective. When you are hearing even moderate level sounds, or you were distracted by a notification you got on your phone, somebody opens or closes their car door, these things actually engage the parasympathetic system that we've been talking about, our sweating, our cortisol, and we don't even know it. That's where journalists and writers are so key, because people want to do the right thing, but they have to know what the right thing is. And for example, if there's a truck outside my window, I won't even know it's there. I'm not paying attention to it, but the minute it turns off, I go, so this is important. And there are things that we cannot do to change the noise, but there's so many things. I mean, just getting a quieter air conditioner, just, really making sure in classrooms that this constant, moderate level, safe for your ears level sound, is kept at a minimum.
Okay, that's a really interesting story idea. Thanks for that. One thing that I think that our reporters might be curious about is the age of the students and when you introduce music. Are musical interventions more effective or less effective when they're implemented? Is it the earlier the better? Do older students do better? Does age have anything to do with it? And anyone can answer.
If I think the simple answer is every age is a good age. You can start right away. There's plenty of science to show that you can start as an old man or old lady, and there will be all kinds of benefits. So the work that we've done we've done it across the lifespan, but the work in school has been done in grammar school kids and kids who are in, such impoverished settings that they didn't have access to a music education until they were in high school. And they had wonderfully strong effects. The important thing is to do it. And the more you do it, the better. So of course, start when you have, I have grandbabies now, and I take their little feet and I sing songs and bang their little feet together. And that's the other thing that people don't recognize. Here's another story for you, is that everyone is musical. Everyone can make music. Music is not about the rarefied conservatory trained person, and it's not only about stars. It is mostly, yes, of course it's for those people, but it is mostly for us. And it's part of our humanness. Humans we've always sung songs. Everybody loves to sing.
It's making me think of another question. But first I'll go to this one and then I'll come back to that. I know what it is. The intensity of these programs that both of you studied. Now, I think that this is an important piece of reporting, is that these programs are pretty serious. They teach the kids serious music. They play in orchestras in groups of kids, and that this is not messing around. Am I correct about that?
Let me just quickly address that, and then I think Steve has a lot of insight as well. Everybody is always, I think we're going wrong by saying, what's the dosage? Like, how often should I play? What instrument's the best instrument? Obviously, the more you do something, the more it will change your nervous system. But my definition of a musician is someone who regularly makes music. So, like in my case, I consider myself a musician because, I'll make music, a couple times a week for half an hour or whatever it is. So I think the important thing is to do it. And, Steve, you had these remarkable findings of just once a week. That's a great big deal. Yeah, if you can do it 4 times a week, that's even better. And also with education in school, we have seen these effects and these biological and academic effects in after-school programs, within school programs, small dose, large dose, just do it.
Yeah, I would definitely endorse the just do it. I will say that as somebody who works a lot with programs and educational interventions across a lot of different areas, including music, I think it is important to kind of calibrate one's expectations for change. And particularly given what Nina was saying earlier about, the fact that our brains are not infinitely plastic to kind of a very discrete and one-off sort of experiences, and that's a good thing. To be rational about kind of what the expectations are for a particular program. What we found is then that 2 years seems to be some kind of threshold, and 2 years of playing, we're 2 to 4 times a week, most days that school is in session. And we just don't know enough yet. There just haven't been enough studies to basically say this is what the kind of dose response curve would look like, because we would need a lot more research. I will say that muchness is one thing, but one of the reasons I always make sure to qualify access to high quality educational opportunities is that a lot of a really bad program or a bad kind of musical training, and when I say bad, I'm not really talking about like where is your hand on that violin. I mean the way that training is delivered. Good teaching, musical teaching, looks like good teaching of reading or any other academic subject in the broadest strokes, in terms of how what sometimes you refer to as process quality. How does the educator interact with their students? And I think there are, I often sometimes refer to the kind of Russian conservatory model of musical training. I don't know that that's going to reduce kids' levels of HPA axis activity. So I think it really is important that the dosage is considered, but also the quality of the instruction, and fundamentally on some fundamental level, what the nature of the interaction between the student and the child, as the teacher and the child, is looking like.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And here's another story for you is, teachers are my heroes. Teachers are, a good teacher is just the best person in the world. And I'm married to a music teacher. I think that it is really difficult in general to have a good teacher for anything. And this is something that we need as a society. We need to cherish more. We need to foster, because it is very, very important. And the number of hours kind of goes by the wayside if you have someone who you're interacting with once a week who is tremendous. That can go a long way.
And it's connected to, I just spoke with a professor a few weeks ago talking about how the lack of music education, how so many programs have been cut over the last decade or so, is starting to show up in the students who are becoming music teachers now. And they have a very large deficit in the number of kids who will be able to teach music, because they haven't had enough music in their K-12 experience to be able to teach it. And so, we kind of I think that there's also a lot of interesting stories there about how we're going to have this huge music shortage when we have all these, proven benefits to music education. We want to take some questions from our audience as well. And I have some more questions too. But first, let's go to our reporter questions and see what we've got here. So here's one from Jill Barshay, who's at the Hechinger Report. She says, music is good, but sound can damage our brains. Is it a good or bad idea for kids to listen to music while they do their homework?
So first of all, there are always, two things that are different can both be true. So sound is very good in the context of music. Sound in the context of meaningless sound is not very good for your biology. Both of those things are true. As far as the music that you might or might not listen to, and everybody is different. And we make different associations in our life based on on our experiences and in part by our genetic makeup. And there is no answer to, there's no single answer. You know, people need to figure out for themselves. Some students will study very well with music in the background. Some will study very well with classical music or just music that doesn't have words, or some really prefer silence. So this is very, very individual. And I, as someone who measures people's brain responses, so, you know, we measure people's brain responses and then we can also play them back. So one of the things that we do is we measure people's brain responses to every note of, say, a 3-octave keyboard. So then, you know, I'll have Holly's brain responses, and I can play her brain, and you know, I can hear how very, very, very different it is. So everybody, you know, I can play something like A Hard Day's Night, and I can play the same thing from Stephen's brain. And you can recognize it as A Hard Day's Night, but it sounds really different. So we are all really quite different. And so my answer, which is my answer to almost every question that I get from a student who wants to know the answer is it depends.
Great. Jill also has another question that I want to go back to. We've touched on it briefly, but I want to add something to it. She says, how much music training does a child need before the brain rewiring and the executive function improvement are detected? And is the formal instruction the secret sauce? So would simply sitting on your bed and strumming your guitar not necessarily produce these same benefits? And I kind of want to tie something to her question, which is, does singing have these same benefits as even playing an instrument? So there's several questions.
I would say yes for singing, because I've studied that directly.
Okay.
Singing counts, and no matter what you do, it doesn't matter what the formal form of education is. It's just making music. Steve, you probably have some more things to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Nina said before, it depends. You know, the answer depends. I think how long it takes for the rewiring and the EF improvement to be detected depends on a number of factors, one of which is the quality of the instruction. Another is what the nature of the instruction is. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important to mention is that there, and a couple of colleagues and I wrote a paper about this last year. I'll put the link, I'll send it to Angeline in a moment, but it's a strange thing to expect, you know, kind of equifinality of all artistic endeavors or all musical endeavors, right? That they're all going to lead to the same outcomes, right? The answer is that it really depends on a tremendous number of details. So, you know, the work that we do with Play on Philly, one of the reasons that we think participating in ensemble-based musical instruction may influence parasympathetic nervous system activities, because one of the things that the parasympathetic nervous system is known to support is social engagement. And so because the kids are engaging in an ensemble, it kind of strengthens the expectation that there might be an effect on parasympathetic function. I think that a child who was engaged in music, you know, sitting on their bed strumming their guitar, and that was their sole experience with music, would I anticipate that there would be certain benefits? Yes. But again, if all else were equal, would I be less likely to place a bet on there being kind of benefits around social engagement to solo music making? Probably, you know. And so I think it always requires thinking carefully about what is the nature of the child's engagement in this particular type of music making, and what are the kind of development, that's how I think about things, the kind of developmental domains that can tie out to. And I think it typically has to be judged on sort of a case-by-case basis, because there's a lot of variability in even, you know, what orchestral music instruction looks like. It's not a monolith.
And Nina, that makes me think of something that was in the study you did in LA. That wasn't there a mentoring aspect to it wasn't just music lessons. The directors were talking to the kids. Could you talk a little bit about the mentoring?
That was, wonderful, because they had a problem. They had too many kids who wanted to make music, to be in these music programs. And the problem was that they didn't have enough instructors. And so they solved the problem by taking the older kids who had had a couple of years of music instruction and having them mentor the younger kids. And you're, in terms of your motivation, you're going to be really excited if some cool 8th grader is teaching a 5-year-old. You're going to want to pay attention to that. So they did that. And another thing is that people always say, well, and this is another myth of oh, I can't make music, I'm no good. I've learned this from many avenues, including from my husband, who says there are people who will come in for lessons and they're a quick study, they will learn very easily and quickly, but really the ones who make progress are the ones who want it. So the kid who sits on his bed with his guitar and who really wants it, that is what is going to make a difference. And it again brings us back to this holistic nature of sound, as we've been talking about, how it affects how we feel. So how we feel includes what we want, what feels good, what we want, what we don't want. And so that component is a great big part of it. And so, my husband will talk about people who will come in and really have a hard time with very basic rhythm skills or pitch matching and go on to be the best students.
We have another really interesting question for either of you from Sasha Rain. There is a long-held argument about the intellectual superiority of classical music to stimulate the mind. Can you all discuss genre and culture, and does that play a part in these effects for literacy and executive function?
I can certainly tell you from a scientific perspective, it doesn't matter what instrument you play. Yes, singing counts, drumming counts, doesn't matter what genre you play. It even doesn't matter how you've learned music, if you're reading it or listening and playing that way. What matters is that you make music.
Yeah, I would second that and simply add that part of what gets a child to make music is that they want to do it, right? And so I do think, and this is something that we do to discuss a little bit in that paper I mentioned a moment ago, the alignment of what you're offering to students and in terms of culturally and where students are coming from culturally, I think does need to be considered when you're particularly when you're implementing programs with diverse populations of children. I think that a lot of the kind of assumptions of superiority are just of one particular type of music are just kind of part and parcel of broader sort of blinkered thinking, for lack of a better term. So
yeah, in some of my reporting, I met a woman who had started a program for recent immigrants from Central and South America. And so they used all their cultural instruments from their own cultures and learned all their songs. And they saw the same benefit: increased grades, better attendance, better graduation rates. So,
I'll just add one other thing. I will say, though, that one of the things that I think is really, not to get too, flowery, beautiful about music is that there can be things in the music from one cultural background that are really appealing to somebody who's from a completely different background. So I think it's a balancing act of, kind of thinking about, we want to have what we're offering to students have points of relevance, but there's also an opportunity that we don't want to miss about kind of broadening horizons. I think both are important.
That's great. That's great. We are getting ready to wrap this up. So any more questions, please send them along. Jill Barche with another question. Can perfect pitch be learned, or is it genetic?
Perfect pitch, to my view, is a parlor trick. It has nothing, I mean, some people can do it, some people can't. Yes, you can teach it. I mean, you get better at it. But basically, what it is important is that there have been music makers who are fabulous music makers who have perfect pitch, and some who don't have perfect pitch. And it just doesn't matter in terms of your making music and your musicality. So,
I'll say that every musician I've ever met who has perfect pitch was also somewhat suspiciously someone who started studying music very, very young and hearing music all the time, even younger than that. So, you know, I don't know what to make of that exactly.
Okay, so let's wrap this up with one final, and I would love a comment or an observation from both of you, Nina and Stephen, that, you know, often we talk about arts programs as like always being the first on the chopping block when schools and districts are faced with budget cuts. And sometimes the explanation is that, you know, core reading and math skills come first. And so I was just wondering if you would, what's your reaction to that? You know, arts sometimes are treated as a very low level of priority. Thoughts?
I mean, I think it's terrible. It's more than terrible. It's you know, I don't know what else to call it. It's an injustice, right? I mean, I think that everything we know about music already and everything we're continuing to learn indicates that it is a critical aspect of the children's developmental environment, and, you know, systematic, because really, if you think about where we're talking about cutting arts, it is for a very specific subset of students. So when we're talking about that, I think we have to be honest about what we're saying. And really what we're saying is we're taking a key part of some children's developmental environments away systematically on the basis of, you know, familial income, race, ethnicity, and I don't know what you call that other than a real moral failing.
yeah, but you can have both things, you know, having a music education will help. It's probably the best thing you can do to strengthen the core reading, writing, arithmetic, play an instrument, or make music. And the other is, you know, it is such a huge part of being human and of connecting with the world and with each other. And, you know, sadly, our environment, both with respect to music and with respect to other things that are less tangible, like the humanities, important for teaching. You know, people are not giving that the attention that it deserves. And if we were all making more music, I think we would have a better world educationally and socially.
Man, thank you, Nina, and thank you, Stephen, for coming today. I feel like every time I talk to either of you, I learn something. And thanks to all of you who attended today. That's all the time we have for today. And I just like to really, again, thank Stephen and Nina for joining us. And I'd like to thank you, the attendees and the EWA members, for engaging with us on this important conversation. Please complete the evaluation survey in the chat box, because your feedback is really important to EWA. And if you enjoyed today's webinar and you want to learn more about EWA's upcoming online and in-person seminars, please come visit us at ewa.org or subscribe to the EWA Today newsletter to be the first to hear about new events. Thanks for coming. Have a great day.